Hello, welcome to Lecture 8, Refined Utilitarianism, where we take a look at utilitarianism again, but this time through the lens of John Stuart Mill. And so we've talked about Mill quite a few times. I've alluded to him in the Bentham lecture. We talked about him, what was it, Lecture 5, with respect to his thoughts about freedom and authority and how to, navigate that tension between freedom and security and so on. So we're familiar with Mill already. We've been alluding to him again in our discussions of utilitarianism up to this point by way of our discussion of Bentham. And so here we're going to dive in a little bit more detail and find out what Mill has to say about utilitarianism. So as you can tell, right, he's going to offer a more refined version of the theory. I've alluded to this already, but really Bentham and Mill, they're offering essentially the same underlying moral theory. Where they're going to differ, it's primarily in the terms that they use to express these same underlying points. And so they're espousing the same essential theory, but what Mill does a nice job of doing is coming along after Bentham offered that original articulation of the theory, coming along and then addressing a lot of the criticisms that the opponents had raised. The issues they had mentioned with respect to Bentham's rough, crude formulation of theory. And so Mill's going to come along and kind of refine it, tidy it up a bit, answer some of those criticisms. And I mentioned in a previous lecture, probably lecture 5, that one of the things I really like about Mill is the way he is able to really address criticisms, not only in this way, right, but also oftentimes he'll anticipate the criticisms before they're even voiced by the opposition, and so he's anticipatory in that sense, I guess you could say. And so one of the ways, again, that Mill I find something appreciable about Mill. Anyway, so we'll start off the lecture by discussing some of the similarities to Bentham. We'll then go in and dive into the ways in which Mill refines the theory, and in doing so, it addresses a lot of the main criticisms that the opponents of utilitarianism brought up. Most notably, the suggestion on the part of the critics that utilitarianism is a doctrine worthy only of swine. And we'll talk about why the critics suggest this. The critics are saying this of utilitarianism. And Mill's going to come along, and we'll talk about this too, and suggest, no, that's not the case. Utilitarianism is not a doctrine worthy only of swine. Okay? So much more on that here in a moment. That's, again, the prime example, or at least one notable example of a way in which he comes in and defends Bentham's utilitarianism, comes in and defends it, and actually we'll wrap up the lecture by discussing what I would suggest are the four most common criticisms of utilitarianism, and discussing then in turn Mill's responses or rebuttals to those criticisms. And in the process, right, we'll go through some of his famous distinctions in his defense of utilitarianism, and most notably this distinction in terms of pleasures between the quantity or how much pleasure we're experiencing and the quality of the pleasures we're experiencing. So that's a little bit of a roadmap. There's a lot more to it too. I guess most notably we'll talk about as well his optimism with respect to the future. He seems to think that most of the main ills, diseases, and so on that confront the human race, that through due diligence and proper reflection, that's the common theme for Mill, just as it was for Epicurus, reflection. Right, through proper reflection, we'll slowly see those things dissipate. Depression, disease, and so on. And so we'll discuss the ways in which he's kind of optimistic like that, and that actually engenders pretty good discussion usually in the forums. So one of the questions I believe is related to whether or not you share that kind of optimism. Are you as hopeful as Mill with respect to the future? But more on that then as we proceed here in the lecture. Let's go ahead and dive right in then, turning to slide or page 2 of the lecture, titled Utilitarianism Revisited, the slide is. So we'll start right off. This is from the text on page 261. Mill says, quote, "The creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle," and again, Mill oftentimes refers to that, the mantra of utilitarianism, as the greatest happiness principle, whereas Bentham would most often refer to it as the utility principle, but they're pointing at the same thing. So again, the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness, end quote. And what does he mean by happiness? So here you see him, and I alluded to this in the Bentham lecture, he tends to talk in terms of happiness or unhappiness. But what does he mean by happiness? Pleasure and the absence of pain. And what does he mean by unhappiness? Pain and the absence of pleasure. Okay, so even though he and Bentham or he and Epicurus might use slightly different terms sometimes, right? Or Mill might tend to discuss things in terms of happiness. What they're getting at underneath it, again, is essentially the same thing. So much like Epicurus, actually exactly like Epicurus and exactly like Bentham before him, Mill's going to suggest that all we care about, he's a psychological hedonist, right? Naturally, all we care about is pleasure, and we do what we can to pursue that pleasure. Typically, right? It's like again, he's a psychological hedonist. It's kind of a psychological fact, if you will. As he says on 261 of our text, quote, all desirable things are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain, end quote. So again, hopefully you get the idea here. He's essentially offering the same views, not only of Bentham, but more or less of Epicurus. Now, Epicurus, while he, and we hopefully, you've seen how this is the case, right, offered many of the same views, right, pleasure is all that matters, and so on. He didn't voice it in the terms of, say, a moral theory like Bentham and Mill did, but nevertheless, all three of these guys are advancing the same sort of view, right? Pleasure is all that matters. Now, of course, as we'll see here in a moment, Mill's going to agree with Bentham or with Epicurus that having said that, right, pleasure is what matters. These guys are psychological hedonists. We have to proceed in a very measured, rational way. So moving on to slide or page 3, I mentioned one of the main things Mill is most known for is addressing the primary criticisms that were advanced against Bentham's version of utilitarianism, most notably this famous accusation on the part of the critics that utilitarianism is a doctrine worthy only of Swine. Now, why do the critics suggest this? What is it about utilitarianism that makes them suggest that it's a doctrine worthy only of Swine? Well, it goes something like this. Remember what we just said, right? The utilitarians, they suggest all that matters to us and everything we ought to do should focus on maximizing what? Pleasure. Well, hey, guess what? That doesn't sound much different than the rest of, the animal kingdom. Right? How are we then any different? If that's all we care about, if that's all we focus on, and it's all that matters, if these utilitarians are right, how are we any different than pigs? How are we any different than swine? So it's in that sense, right? In suggesting that all that matters to us is pleasure, that the critics suggest utilitarianism is sort of degrading, right? It renders us no different than swine. And it's a doctrine worthy only of Swine. They think that, obviously they find that unsettling. They feel it's degrading. And they're basically suggesting it's an objection to the theory. And so Mill's acknowledging that criticism, right? As he famously admits, these critics deem it, quote, a doctrine worthy only of Swine. Utilitarianism, that is. So again, was actually expressed on 262 of our text, where he comes out and famously says this, or acknowledges this, okay? So we're going to see then how he thinks this criticism can be addressed. And he says, actually, remember that Epicurus dude that we talked about a couple lectures ago? Go consult him, because all of these criticisms, these kinds of criticisms at least, they were the same sort of criticisms that were levied against Epicurus in his day when he advanced the same kind of theories that Bentham and I do, Mill speaking, right? This idea that pleasure is all that matters. Well, then he started getting the same sort of objection Epicurus did. Okay, and so Mill wants to say, look, go read your Epicurus, right? What did Epicurus tell us? While it's all about pleasure, it's not about diving in willy-nilly into every pleasure that presents itself. No, we need to be calculative, measured, proceed in a measured fashion, proceed rationally, however you want to put it. You get the idea, right? It's a thoughtful process. So it's not this just ever-present overindulgence in pleasure, every pleasure that shows itself to us. No, remember with Epicurus that kind of idea that we might have to postpone pleasures in the moment, right? And maybe even endure a little bit of pain in the moment to then generate a much greater pleasure down the road. Okay, so there's this kind of, as the utilitarians would say, utility calculation going on. Okay? And the whole point being, in this case, right, that it's a measured, rational, reflective sort of thing. Mill would say, you need to do that, right? Look, or you need to acknowledge that Epicurus and I are saying this sort of thing, right? It's not just dive into all these pleasures. It's a rational, reflective process. And in doing so, then you would realize that we recognize certain sorts of distinctions. For example, this very, 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 very important distinction, which will provide the answer to this problem, so to speak. Right? So Mill wants to say, look, it's possible, so I'm turning to slide 5 now. It's possible for us utilitarians to suggest that it really is all that matters to us is pleasure, and yet at the same time appreciate a difference between human beings and the rest of, all the other animal species. Okay, so how is that possible to suggest that, all we focus on and care about is pleasure and not render us the same as swine? Well, here's how. Recognize, for example, a distinction that Epicurus would be inclined to recognize, a distinction between quantity and qualities of pleasure. Okay, not only can we talk about pleasure in terms of how much, Mill wants to say we can talk about pleasures in terms of its quality, right? There are certain types of pleasures that are just qualitatively better than others, regardless of how much of each respective pleasure we might have. The one, right, is qualitatively of a different kind and much better. Right? And so this is going to be his ticket, and this is how he addresses the distinction. He's going, or this criticism. He's going to say human beings are uniquely capable of experiencing certain higher quality pleasures. So it's true that swine and humans both only care about pleasures, but human beings are uniquely capable of experiencing certain types of pleasures. And so thus, again, that's going to be his answer, right? So it's not a doctrine worthy only of swine because it appreciates that there is a unique difference, right? There is something appreciably different about us versus, pigs, for example. Okay, so again, he thinks the whole issue revolves around this distinction, right? Or what the critics ought to recognize, right? This distinction between quantity and quality of pleasures. So he says things like on page 262, quote, some kinds of pleasures are more desirable and more valuable than others. It would be absurd that while in estimating all other things, quality is considered as well as quantity, the estimation of pleasure should be supposed to depend on quantity alone. Okay, so he's pointing out that with respect to other things, we talk about them not only in terms of how much, but their quality. He wants to say we ought to do the same thing with respect to pleasure and realize, right? We can talk about how much of a given pleasure we have, but also what kind of pleasure it is. How good of a pleasure is it, if you will? Now, Mill, if you're going to suggest, right, that there are different kinds of pleasures and that some are qualitatively better or of a higher quality, well, you owe it to us to, how do we figure that out, right? You owe us some sort of explanation in terms of, how is it that we come to recognize some as higher and some as lower, and he does that. He talks about that on 262 as well. He says of two different pleasures, they distinguish them as follows. Quote, of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, that is the more desirable pleasure. And this gets into his idea of, I'm going to go ahead and, we're turning to slide 6 here. Go ahead and erase this stuff. So we're still talking about this distinction, right? Quantity versus quality of pleasures. And we're talking about, well, how is it, Mill, that we distinguish between any given pleasures, which are the higher and the lower qualities? And he says, well, you ask the people that have experience of both of them, or what he famously calls the competent judges. Ask those dudes or dudettes, whoever they may be, and whichever they say is the higher quality pleasure is the higher quality pleasure. So he has this notion of competent judges. And all he means by that is, again, whoever has experience of whatever pleasures we're considering. Right. So what he means, right, is pleasure A and pleasure B. Which one's the higher quality pleasure? We're trying to flesh out this distinction, right, between quantity and quality of pleasures and how there can be higher and lower quality pleasures. Well, how do we figure out which is the higher and which is the lower quality pleasure of two particular pleasures that we're contrasting here? let's say A and B, right? A versus B, pleasure A and pleasure B. Well, Mill says, ask the people, and this makes sense, right? Ask the people who have experienced both of them, and ask them which one they prefer. And if the idea is, if 95% of them say, whoa, this one, he wants to say, well, then that's clearly the higher quality pleasure. Okay. On the other hand, if say it's more equivalent, 47 and 53 or something like that, well, then they're roughly of the same quality, right? Neither one's higher or lower than the other in some sense, right? So, but the whole point is, if there's a significant difference, right? If there's a marked difference in the preference, then that's clearly then indicative of there being a higher quality pleasure. And this one can be, right, qualitatively of a higher kind, if you will. So ask the competent judges, who again are just the people that have experience of both, and whichever they give their preference to, that's the higher quality pleasure. And if it's about the same, well, then there is no higher quality pleasure amongst those two, right? They're about the same. Okay, this is from 264, from slide 6. Quote, on a question which is the best worth having of two pleasures, or which of two modes of existence is the most grateful to the feelings, the judgment of those who are qualified by knowledge of both, or if they differ, that of the majority among them must be admitted as final. Okay, so he does offer us a way then to figure out which are the higher and which are the lower quality pleasures. And presumably, right, once we gain experience of these various pleasures, we ourselves will be able to discern which are the higher and which are the lower quality pleasures. He also further reflects and points out, right, that this is turning to slide 7, that human beings, not only do we have this capacity to experience uniquely these certain higher quality pleasures, we prefer them. Okay, we prefer the higher quality pleasures. What he means by that is we're not going to be just satisfied with the life of a swine. Okay, and he recognizes that. And utilitarianism, he wants to say, recognizes that. And that's why it's not a doctrine worthy only of the swine, because it appreciates that we human beings want more than a pig-like existence. It's not going to be enough for us. We have that capacity for the higher quality pleasures, and we won't be satisfied or content until we have some indulgence in those higher quality pleasures. If all we have are pig-like pleasures, food, sex, sleep, and so on, if that's all we have, we won't be satisfied. And I think that's an important point, and he's probably right on that, or at least for most people. Now, he does address, as we'll see here shortly, there are some exceptions, which on the face of it, if there's exceptions, wouldn't that be, wouldn't that undermine your theory? Well, he'll explain them here in a moment. Why are there these exceptions? Okay. But on a whole, people, he says, human beings, we have a preference for these higher quality pleasures. Right? Well, not only do we want to have enough to eat, do we want a good amount of sleep and so on, but we want to play chess. We want to reflect on the strategy in a sporting event. Right? We want these higher quality pleasures that utilize our quote unquote higher faculties. So there's also this related distinction then between higher faculties, which then allow us, right, this capacity to experience the higher quality pleasures, and the quote unquote lower faculties then, which would be common to us and other animals, right? We uniquely have these quote unquote higher faculties. What he means by that, something like reason, which then allow us unique access to these particular pleasures that the rest of the animal kingdom doesn't have access to. And again, the idea here is we won't be satisfied unless we have pleasures that cater to these as well. Okay, and we want this stuff too, right? We need sleep and food and so on, right? But that won't be good enough. We'll be miserable. We'll be depressed if that's all we have, or most of us anyway. So that leads them to say things like, on 262, quote, human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. Very important. So, turning to slide 8, we prefer these higher quality pleasures and at least some indulgence in our quote-unquote higher faculties. 262, humans naturally, quote, give a most marked preference to the manner of existence which employs their higher faculties, end quote. 263, what's more, quote, a being of higher faculties requires more to make him happy, end quote. So it is harder to satisfy us, right? Again, because we need more than just, the pig basics, right? Food, sex, sleep, and so on. Yet nevertheless, right, Mill also points out we would never yearn for a lower type of existence. Just because we realize it's harder to please us, nevertheless, we wouldn't want to become pigs just because it's easier to satisfy a pig. So that's what he said. That's what he's getting on 263 when he's pointing out that despite requiring more to be happy, quote, he, and that being us or humans, can never really wish to sink into what he feels to be a lower grade of existence, end quote. So again, even though it's easier to satisfy pigs and other animals, right, because we require more to be happy, we nevertheless would never wish to become these other animals. And that's because the happiness we do experience, and we'll elaborate on this here in a moment, is of a much richer, higher quality, or so says Mill, right? This is the argument, which then more than makes up for any lack we might have in terms of, or any deficiency in terms of not being able to be as content as often or something like that. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, so we mentioned, right? So turning to slide 9. What about the people, though? I know Billy Bob, and he's perfectly content laying on the couch drinking Guinness and eating Doritos all day, right? Doesn't need anything more than, drink, food, sleep, etc. So in other words, Mill, what about these people that don't seem to, right, cater to the higher faculties or choose the higher pleasures, so to speak? Doesn't that undermine your suggestion or your theory that, one of the defining features of human beings is that we have these higher faculties and that we constantly prefer them, right? And we wouldn't be satisfied without indulging in them. And he says, look, there are some exceptions, but just because they're exceptions doesn't mean they undermine my theory, Mill speaking, right? They are the exceptions, okay? They're the exceptions to the rule. Okay, and typically when you have these exceptions, so 98% of the time what I'm saying is true, Mill speaking, right? And then when you have those 2% which seem to, for whatever reason, indulge in merely the lower quality pleasures, they're typically for two reasons, which, are easily explained. One, there's no other way to put it, for a lack of a better way of putting it. Rather, they have a infirmity of character, as he puts it, or in some sense, they don't make good decisions. They have a more like pig-like character, right? They're more animal, or I mean, how would you put these? Pig-like. They're more pig-like. They're not as refined, I guess you would say, right? They're more animalistic in their character. Okay? So he says that's what I'm getting on option 1 here, right? A lot of these people, right, that seem to not care about their higher faculties and the pleasures associated with them, they just have a more pig-like nature, right? They're not as developed or refined of people, if you will. I mean, as crass as that might sound. So he says things like on 263, these types of people, quote, they pursue sensual indulgences to the injury of health, though perfectly aware that health is the greater good, end quote. So for whatever reason, they don't, they're not as inclined, right, to focus on or care about and indulge in these higher pleasures. Or, and I would probably argue that maybe this is more often the case when we're trying to explain, why is it there are these people for whom this isn't true, right? That we have this marked preference for the higher faculty. More often the time when that's the case, it's probably the second reason, and that's that, a lot of us, we have to work our butts off, right? We work 3 jobs just to make ends meet. And the last thing we want to do when we get home at 4 in the morning after getting off our night shift or whatever is come home and read Mill or play chess or reflect on the strategy in the sports game. All we can do is come home, eat something, crash, get a couple hours of sleep before the next job. Okay, so Mill says for a lot of people, this can be explained, right? These exceptions can be explained because the practical circumstances they're dealt, they have no choice but to just worry about the basics, right? Food, sleep, and so on. They don't have the time or opportunity or the leisure, if you will, to indulge in their higher quality pleasures. So because of the demands of the real world, lower pleasures may be, quote, either the only ones to which they have access or the only ones which they are any longer capable of enjoying. All right. So in general, he says this is true. We have these higher faculties, this rational capacity, if you will, which then allows us to experience these much richer, higher quality pleasures. Okay, and then we'll come full circle back to the question, then turning to slide 10. Is utilitarianism a doctrine worthy only of swine? Well, no. Okay, he thinks he's offered a way, right, that the utilitarian can say that all that matters to human beings is pleasure, and at the same time not be demeaning to human beings, and and appreciate that there is a difference between human beings and other animals. Because again, what is the answer? Human beings are uniquely capable of experiencing certain types of pleasures, higher quality pleasures. Other animals can't experience those. So it's not a doctrine worthy only of swine. It does appreciate and respect, the dignity of human beings, if you will. So that's what I'm getting at on slide 10 there with all those piggies at the bottom. We are not just a bunch of pigs. And there's more to us. And I meant to mention this a moment ago when we were talking about, while we appreciate that it takes a lot more to make us happy, we wouldn't wish to become pigs, right? And I mentioned that's because when we do experience happiness, it's of such a richer, higher quality that it more than makes up for whatever we lacked in the other way, right? And that's what he's getting at when he distinguishes between happiness and contentment. So the difference between us and other animals, right, is that they are more easily contented. Okay, and what does he mean by contentment? He actually defines it on 263 at the top here. It's basically fulfilling one's capacity for enjoyment. Okay, and remember, other animals, they don't have that higher quality access to the higher quality pleasures. So their capacity for enjoyment, the threshold is very low. It's very easy to fulfill that. And so he's pointing that out. Other animals, pigs, they're very easy to satisfy. All you got to do is provide them a little mud, a little food, and so on, a few things here and there, and they're easily contented. Not the case for us, right? It takes a lot more to satisfy us because we also need the satisfaction of those higher quality faculties or higher quality pleasures. We need access to those, right? And to entertain, if you will, our higher level faculties. So we're harder to make content, but then on the other hand, happiness, which is kind of like for him a measure of the richness of one's experience, right, the quality of one's experience, this is where then we have the upper hand, right? Our ability to experience happiness is of a much greater, we have a much greater ability to experience a richer sort of happiness, if you will. That's where he wants to say we have the upper hand, right? And why we wouldn't, even though it's harder for us to feel content and to be satisfied all the time, we nevertheless wouldn't want to be pigs, right? Because when we do experience happiness, again, it's very satisfying. It's very profound versus the happiness of the pig, right? It's never very, very rich, if you will. So if we were trying to measure it, right, the pig's happiness, how happy are they? Right, it doesn't waver much, but us, well, we experience these peaks, and when we do experience, when we do maximize what we're capable of, right, it's way better. Okay? So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Again, he's talking a lot about this on 265. We're at really 263 to 265. He does kind of offer a sense of what he means by happiness on 265 when he describes it as follows. He says, it's not a life, this is a quote, not a life of rapture, but moments of such. So it's not going to be constantly up here, right? But it's moments of this rich rapture or happiness. But moments of such, and an existence made up of few and transitory pains, right? We're going to have pains, many and various pleasures, and having as the foundation of the whole, not to expect more from life than it is capable of bestowing. A life thus composed, to those who have been fortunate enough to obtain it, has always appeared worthy of the name of happiness. So again, the general idea here is while animals are more easily contented, satisfied, if you will, they do not experience the type or the quality of happiness that we do, or that we're capable of. And this is why a very famous quote from 263. This reminded me, Epicurus says something very similar to this too. And so another example of Epicurus' influence shining through on both Bentham and Mill. Mill is famous for this quote. He says, it's better, and this is why, this sort of thinking here, it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. All right, so he offers us some tips. There's a couple things he thinks, right? So what's the recipe for soliciting or eliciting the happy life, right? To procuring happiness? He thinks there's two key ingredients. He talks about this at 265, 266 primarily. So what is happiness, or what's our ticket look like to happiness? Two main ingredients that can help us. Tranquility, or like a peace of mind. And then excitement. If we can get these in our life, then we can deal both with pains and pleasures a lot more. So let me rephrase that. If we have these in our lives, we're better equipped to deal with pains, or alternatively, a lack of pleasure, right? Which I guess you could kind of argue is the flip side of the same coin, but right. So in other words, peace of mind allows us to kind of deal with a lack of a very pleasurable life, right? If we don't experience a lot of pleasures in our everyday lives, as long as we have a tranquil or peaceful mindset, we'll be able to deal with that. Or alternatively, we might have a lot of pain, he says, okay, but as long as we can have a lot of excitement in our life, we'll be fine, right? We'll be willing to put up with the pain there. So these can help alleviate either, right, the sense that we don't have enough pleasure, a dearth of pleasure, or situations where we might, have too much pain. If we can, promote, right, these qualities within us, then we'll be better able to deal with those situations, right, where we're, again, experiencing pains or not enough pleasures. And that's what he's getting at on 265. He says, quote, with much tranquility, many find that they can be content with very little pleasure. With much excitement, many can reconcile themselves to a considerable quantity of pain. So how do you become more satisfied? Epicurus also gave us, a recipe for happiness, and here you have Mill doing the same thing. Focus on developing these, right? Focus on soliciting more excitement in your life so that you are then better able to, when pains pop up, sort of brush them aside. And at the same time, focus on maybe meditation and promoting more peace of mind so that when life seems a bit boring, you're able to just kind of go with the flow. And what's the problem with people that, despite seeming to have whatever they need, don't ever seem to be quite happy? He blames this on a couple main factors: selfishness and a lack of reflection. And not surprisingly, that sounds reminiscent of Epicurus. Reflect, reflect, reflect. So he suggests, again, selfishness and lack of mental cultivation, that these are the primary factors, right, at play when people, despite all their attempts, don't ever seem to be happy. Right? They can't ever seem to be satisfied. Why is that? Well, they're either too wrapped up in their own lives, themselves, or they're not reflecting enough. Okay? So this is why he says on 266, quote, when people who are tolerably fortunate, in their outward lot do not find in life sufficient enjoyment to make it valuable to them, the cause generally is caring for nobody but themselves. Okay? So if you find yourself constantly bored and miserable, the upshot here, what Mill's suggesting, is maybe you're too wrapped up in your own plights, and maybe you should focus on others for a while, and maybe you'll become distracted, and before you know it, you won't be focused on your misfortunes anymore. Right? Quote, this is another quote on 266, next to selfishness, the principal cause which makes life unsatisfactory is want of mental cultivation. Read a book, reflect a bit, and you'll realize that maybe life's not as bad as you're making it seem to be. So that's slide 12. We'll move on to slide 13. I mentioned this at the outset. Mill seems to be an optimist. Look, a lot of us might be down. Maybe we don't have, we're not in the best physical shape. Maybe there's, disease, and so on that we're facing. But on a whole, he seems to be sort of optimistic that in the future, as long as we reflect, again, that's the big issue for a lot of us. We need to properly reflect and come together and not be so focused on ourselves, right? Come together. But as long as we do these sorts of things, take these sorts of steps, use the brains, the rational capacity, the philosophers always point to, right? Use that rational capacity we have, then he thinks that we can kind of almost make, disease, all these things that make us unhappy and unhealthy, make them almost entirely disappear. Like, he's very, very much an optimist. So he says things on like on 266, quote, poverty in any sense implying suffering may be completely extinguished by the wisdom of society, combined with the good sense and providence of individuals, end quote. And he's probably right there. Distribution of wealth, if we just reflected a bit more on that, maybe instituted policy change and so on. I think that's what he's getting at by wisdom of society, right? If we just reflect on these kinds of things, maybe poverty isn't something we're always going to be straddled with. Maybe with a different sort of economic philosophy in place, doing things slightly different, maybe we could make poverty go away. That's Mill's suggestion anyway. Of disease, he says also in 266, disease, quote, may be indefinitely reduced by dimensions by good physical and moral education and proper control of noxious influences. Okay, so the physical ailments, disease and so on, even those can be dealt with in a significant manner. And then in 267, quote, all the grand sources, in short, of human suffering are in a great degree, many of them almost entirely, conquerable by human care and effort. We just got to sit down and reflect enough to figure things out. So he's very much an optimist. Looking forward to seeing what you guys think if you guys address question 3 there for reflection time. Do you share his optimism with respect to the future? Now, to wrap up the lecture here on Mill, I want to discuss what I would say are the 4 most common objections, or at least 4 very common objections to utilitarianism, and Mill's responses to them. So you should be familiar with each of these objections, some of which we've already mentioned and discussed, and also then familiar with what Mill's going to say in response to these. Okay? Excuse me. So first, and I don't know that I'm trying to think if I've even mentioned this one yet. How would I have not mentioned this objection yet? I don't know that I have. This one is so now I should have put this up here, but this first one is actually arguably the most common, and it's going to be the main criticism of the deontologists, people like Kant, and it's also going to be Bernard Williams in the next lecture. We're going to talk a little bit about Bernard Williams and his critique of utilitarianism. One of his main criticisms. It basically revolves around this criticism as well. So very common. I would even argue probably the most common objection to utilitarianism is this idea that it's cold and calculated. In other words, it doesn't afford enough respect for individuals. We're just a means to an end. All we are just the variables in this long utility calculation. We're no more, no less. That's the sense in which it's cold and calculating. That's in other words, utilitarianism treats us in such a cold and calculating fashion. And what these critics have in mind is that the individuals, they're not afforded any degree of respect, right? Or at least it's not near enough. That's again going to be Bernard Williams' big issue. They're just one of infinite variables in this long utility calculation. And what's more, they can be sacrificed, right? At a moment's notice, if doing so would promote the greatest utility. A baby, an individual, a whole family, a whole country, in theory, according to utilitarianism, might be required to be sacrificed if in doing so would promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Well, isn't that kind of cold and calculating, the critics want to suggest? Don't these individuals deserve a little bit more consideration? I mean, aren't they more than just a variable in a long utility calculation. That's the sense of the criticism that the critics have in mind, okay? So now Mill wants to say, well, hold on, or at least this would be what Mill would try to say in response to this kind of criticism. It's not true that utilitarianism lacks an appreciation for individuals, because in fact, individuals do matter, and if they are that adversely affected by a proposed action, then it's going to shine through in the utility calculation. So let me give you an example. So this is Mill responding to this criticism. Okay, we can either, and so I'm going to give this example as if we were in class. Okay, because it works better. So A and B, we have two proposed courses of action here. We can either A is tell a joke. Whoops, let me give them the at sign. Tell a joke at students' expense, or B is not do this. So what I mean is, so if we were all in here, right, and we were doing this face to face, by now I would have gotten to know all of you very well, and I'd say I'm going to pick on Josie here. Now Josie's not really like this. She's perfectly fine. We all know she's very cheery and upbeat and so on. But we're going to assume, for an example here, that she's at her wit's end. She's been struggling. She's very severely depressed, and she comes in for class tonight. And I'm going to tell a joke here. I have the option of telling a joke, and it's at her expense. I can tell the joke at her expense, and we all get a little laugh, right? So if I do A, okay, the idea is, what does that calculation look like? Let me make this clear up here. So what does that calculation for A look like? It would look like this. I'm telling the joke at Josie's expense, and the idea is this is going to send her over the edge. She goes home, and I always say this, right? Of course, this would never happen. She goes home and kills herself. It pushes her over the edge. This joke does. Okay, so the idea is, well, myself and the rest of the class, we'll get a little laugh. So let's say there's 20 people in here, including myself. We'll get one util pleasure from it. So 20 positive, right? But then she goes home and kills herself. Mill's going to say, well, that's a huge negative, right? And I say, well, Josie, what's your life worth? It's like 7,543,22.651. Repeating util, something like that. You get the idea. Okay, that's huge. So it's going to be a huge negative versus B. If I didn't tell the joke, we wouldn't have that 20 utils. Let's call that negative 20. Right, but we wouldn't have this huge monumental negative here. So really, it's minus 20 versus this minus 20. Right, it's minus 20 versus minus 77 million or whatever. Right. So hopefully you're getting the idea here. Mel's saying, look, if the individual in the circumstances is going to be that affected by a proposed course of action, it's going to shine through in the calculation to the point where, hey, the utility calculation tells me don't tell the joke. Okay, so it's not true that that my theory, Mill speaking, doesn't afford individuals enough respect. We do afford individuals respect, and we do it in the fairest way possible, right? We treat everybody exactly the same in this calculation. But hey, again, if you are that significantly affected, it's going to alter the equation, and it's going to affect our end result decision. So that's Mill's response there. Okay, so that's the cold calculating. We will pick up on that, particularly in the second part of the next lecture, Lecture 9, when we talk about Bernard Williams. And then in much more detail, we'll enhance our sort of focus on this criticism as well, again, when we get to Kant and deontology. Okay, that's their big issue with utilitarians. They're not offering enough respect for the individuals. They're treating humans merely as means and not as ends in themselves, as Kant famously says. Okay, so that's criticism 1. Criticism 2, we've already talked about. It's the main one we talked about throughout the lecture. So the suggestion is, number 2 here, utilitarianism's emphasis on pleasure is degrading and renders it a quote-unquote doctrine worthy only of swine. We remember what Mill said, right? No, that's not true. It's true that all we care about is pleasure, and the utilitarians correctly point that out. But hey, we are uniquely capable of experiencing certain kinds of pleasure, and other animals can't do that. So it's not a doctrine worthy only of swine. We appreciate what's unique about humans, Right? So there goes that objection. So that was the second one. The third one, I think it's the most easily dismissed. It's this idea that, hey, in focusing on happiness, that for a lot of people that seems like an inherently selfish sort of endeavor. But again, what do all these utilitarians immediately point to? The utility principle or the greatest happiness principle. And right in that principle, what does it say? You always ought to do whatever promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number, meaning everyone considered. And not only that, remember for Bentham and Mill, seemingly that includes not just human beings, but all sentient creatures in so much as that's possible. So this is certainly not a selfish process, and I think that's very clear, and at least with respect to all the utilitarians I'm familiar with. So utilitarianism is concerned with securing the greatest happiness for the greatest number or humanity in general, not with an individual's happiness. Okay, now an individual's happiness does matter, but it's only one variable amongst a ton, right? So it's certainly not a selfish thing. The fourth objection, and we've hinted at this one way back in the beginning of lecture 7, I mentioned how important that lecture was, especially at the beginning when we really carved out what utilitarianism is in general, and we went through a lot of distinctions. One of those distinctions was act versus rule utilitarianism, and that hinted at one of the huge issues. If it's not the cold and calculating objection that's the most common, I would say it's this one, and that's that it's cumbersome. Utilitarianism is not practical. It's tedious. The very process undermines itself, right? This very idea that we have to go around performing utility calculations undermines our utility, right? It makes us miserable. That sort of suggestion, that sort of criticism, really, we talked about how that gave birth, you might argue, to the rule utilitarians, right? This whole class of utilitarians that seem to recognize these kinds of practical concerns. Go back to that at the beginning of lecture 7 if you forgot what rule utilitarianism is. So that's the criticism, right? Utilitarianism requires us to perform these constant, complicated calculations, which doesn't seem practical, maybe even possible. For you. Mill does talk about this in our reading from 271 to 272. He says most of the time, these calculations aren't that difficult. It's fairly obvious, oftentimes without any considerable reflection at all, what course of action is going to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number or the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. It's usually quite obvious. And in those cases where it's difficult, it's not like we're helpless, he says. We have all of human history to rely on. Go read the history books, see what others have done before when faced with similar circumstances. Go ask your wise elders, go ask grandma, grandpa, mom, dad. Right? We have all these resources that we can utilize in those tough situations. So the suggestion that it's not practical is overblown, Mill's suggesting. Again, most often, 90% of the time, if not more, he would say it's fairly obvious what the proper course of action is that's going to promote the greatest happiness or greatest pleasure for the greatest number. And then when it's not, we have resources we can use. Again, not that difficult. He talks about that on 271 to 272, the bottom one there. And that's it for Mill. A lot here, but pretty straightforward, I feel like. Another virtue of Mill in my mind, pretty clear, I think, what he has to say, usually. He can talk about some pretty complicated stuff, but more closer to our time, so the English isn't like this old English, typically. A lot easier, I feel like, anyway, to understand than some of these other guys. Anyway, so that's it for Mill. We will, in the next lecture, talk about Kai Nielsen and Bernard Williams, who I've alluded to a few times here. And I'll talk about them in conjunction because what's interesting is they actually have one another in their crosshairs when they're duking it out in the scholarly journals back in, I want to say it was the 40s and 50s and 60s, back when they were writing these articles that you are assigned to read and that we'll talk about in the next lecture. They are specifically addressing one another, right? So Kai Nielsen is going to be a contemporary defender of utilitarianism. And then Bernard Williams is going to address, right, or echo some of the criticisms, or at least one of the criticisms we talked about, that utilitarianism is cold and calculating. And so it'll be nice to juxtapose their views in the next lecture. Some really fun examples, hypothetical thought experiments too, that we'll talk about. The famous fat man in the cave example. So look forward to that one if you haven't done the reading yet. It's a pretty fun one to talk about usually. Anyway, I'll leave you then with the reflection time. So we're not quite done with utilitarianism. The first part of the next lecture, we'll talk about Nielsen, and then at that point, right, move into the second part of lecture 9, then we'll kind of shift to focusing on the opponents of utilitarianism, and then also deontology, which are kind of one and the same, right? So we'll sort of transition then to the opposite side, the second half of lecture 9. But I'll leave you then with our reflection time questions. This first one, is there anything Mill talked about, higher versus lower quality pleasures maybe, that we could use when reflecting on whether he would sign up for the experience machine? Remember Robert Nozick's experience machine and how he thought that was presented an issue for the hedonists, people like Bentham, because people weren't signing up for this experience machine, which in theory maximized their experience of pleasure, which was all that mattered to people like Bentham, right? And so Nozick's idea was, well, doesn't that disprove your theory? Well, is there anything, and again, his whole presumption was that we would not sign up. We would not do that experience machine. And I mentioned that maybe he is being presumptuous. So what, anyway, what do you think Mill would have to say regarding this machine? Do you think he would say, well, yeah, we'd sign up if there was such a machine? Or is there something he had to say that we talked about that would maybe give him a way to say no, we shouldn't sign up, and still be consistent with his utilitarianism? Hopefully that made sense. So that's question 1 there. And what do you think about that distinction between the higher and lower quality pleasures? So we all have this sense, or at least most people, that human beings are different than other animals. But how? It's always hard to capture that difference. And he tries to do it through this discussion of higher and lower quality pleasures. That again, we're uniquely capable of experiencing those higher quality pleasures. Does that do a sufficient job of articulating the difference between us and other animals? I've always put it in terms of, this is completely you can stop the video now if you want. This is a completely different aside here, but I've thought a lot about this too. What is the difference between us and other sentient creatures, like a dog or something like that? And for me, I always put it in terms of consciousness. So like a dog and a human, what's the difference? We both have consciousness. We're both aware of what's going on. I've always thought of the difference, and maybe you'll agree, maybe not, of coming down to self-consciousness and being aware of our awareness. To me, that's where the difference lies, right? We are aware of being aware. We're aware of our very existence, right? That becomes a problem for many of us, right? Why are we here? What's going on? Dogs don't do that, right? They're not self-conscious. They're not aware of their awareness. They're not aware of their existence. Thus, the existence and the awareness isn't an issue for it, right? It doesn't, hence, they don't have existential crises. So I would argue, what's the difference? Self-consciousness. We're aware of our awareness, aware of existing, and that then opens the floodgates for all these problems we have. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed the lecture. Stay tuned for lecture 9, where we continue our discussion of utilitarianism by way of discussing Kai Nielsen's very intriguing hypothetical thought experiments, and then Bernard Williams' criticisms of what Nielsen had to say. Until then.